You already know the answer, don't you? Deep in your bones, in that ancient feminine wisdom that civilization tried to make you forget, you understand exactly what happens when you stop being available to a man who takes you for granted. Yet here you are, perhaps scrolling through your phone at 2 in the morning, wondering why he hasn't texted back, why his energy feels distant, why you always seem to be the one reaching out first. The truth is both simple and revolutionary. The moment you stop feeding his unconscious need for validation, his entire psychological framework shifts, and suddenly you become the very thing he can't stop thinking about. Carl Jung understood something profound about human psychology that most relationship advice completely misses. He spoke of the anima and animus, those hidden aspects of the masculine and feminine psyche that drive our deepest attractions and repulsions. When a woman constantly makes herself emotionally available to a man, she inadvertently activates his shadow self, that dark, unconscious part of his psyche that takes without giving, that consumes without appreciating. This isn't about manipulation or game playing. It's about understanding the fundamental psychological dynamics that govern how men and women relate to each other on the deepest levels. The feminine archetype has been conditioned for centuries to give, to nurture, to be endlessly available for others' emotional needs. But this conditioning creates a psychological trap that Jung called the participation mystique, where a woman loses her individual identity by merging too completely with another person's emotional landscape. When you constantly text him first, when you always make yourself available for his last-minute plans, when you sacrifice your own needs to accommodate his schedule, you're not being loving, you're being unconscious. You're participating in a dynamic that diminishes your own psychological sovereignty and reduces you to a supporting character in his narrative. The psychological process of individuation, which Jung considered the central task of adult development, requires that we differentiate ourselves from others' expectations and projections. For a woman in a relationship, this means learning to hold her own emotional center even when the man she cares about is pulling away, being inconsistent, or taking her presence for granted. The paradox is that the more you chase, the more you confirm his unconscious belief that you're not going anywhere, which allows him to invest less energy in the relationship. But when you withdraw your constant availability, when you create what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, something fascinating happens in his psyche. His anima, the feminine aspect of his unconscious mind, becomes activated in a way it never was when you were always there. Suddenly, the psychological space that was filled with your constant attention becomes empty, and nature abhors a vacuum. His mind begins to fill that emptiness with thoughts of you, with questions about your emotional state, with concerns about whether he's lost something valuable. This isn't about playing hard to get. It's about reclaiming your psychological autonomy and allowing the natural dynamics of attraction to reassert themselves. The shadow work involved in this process is profound for both people involved. When you stop being constantly available, you force yourself to confront your own fears of abandonment, your need for external validation, your unconscious belief that you have to earn love through constant giving. These are deep psychological wounds that often stem from childhood experiences of conditional love, where you learned that your worth was dependent on how much you could give to others. Simultaneously, your absence forces him to confront his own shadow material, the parts of himself that have become lazy in love, entitled to your attention, comfortable with taking without reciprocating. The discomfort he feels when you're no longer constantly available isn't really about missing you. It's about his unconscious mind recognizing that he may have been taking something precious for granted. This discomfort is actually a gift because it can catalyze his own psychological growth if he chooses to lean into it rather than simply seeking another source of validation. The ancient Stoic philosophers understood this dynamic intuitively. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. When you stop chasing a man and start focusing on your own emotional development, you're practicing a form of emotional stoicism that transforms your entire energetic signature. You're no longer dependent on his responses for your emotional stability, which paradoxically makes you infinitely more attractive to his unconscious mind. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the importance of maintaining one's inner citadel, that sacred psychological space that no external circumstance can touch. When you learn to cultivate this inner sanctuary, when you stop looking to him for emotional completion, you develop what Jung called psychological virginity, a kind of pristine wholeness that draws others to you like a magnet. This isn't about becoming cold or unavailable. It's about becoming so deeply rooted in your own worth that you can offer genuine love from a place of abundance rather than need. The transformation that occurs when you stop chasing and start embodying your own completeness is nothing short of alchemical. You move from what Jung would call the pure or eternal child archetype, always seeking external validation, to the queen archetype, sovereign over your own emotional domain. This shift is viscerally felt by every person in your orbit, especially by men who have unconsciously relied on your emotional labor to avoid doing their own inner work. The neurochemical reality of what happens when you withdraw your attention is both fascinating and predictable. When a man becomes accustomed to regular doses of your emotional availability, his brain develops specific neural pathways that expect this stimulation. Your texts, your attention, your emotional responsiveness literally become addictive to his reward system in ways he doesn't consciously understand. The dopamine hits he receives from your consistent availability create a psychological dependency that he's likely never examined. But here's where the psychology becomes truly interesting. When you suddenly stop providing this consistent stimulation, his brain doesn't simply adjust and move on. Instead, it goes into what psychologists call extinction burst, where the seeking behavior actually intensifies before it diminishes. This is the neurological basis for why men often seem to pursue women more intensely after those women have stepped back. His unconscious mind interprets your absence as a threat to his reward system, triggering an urgent need to restore the previous dynamic. Jung spoke extensively about the anima projection, where men unconsciously project their own feminine qualities onto the women in their lives. When you're constantly available, you become a container for his anima rather than a sovereign individual with your own psychological depth. He begins to relate to you as an extension of himself rather than as a complete person with your own needs, desires, and boundaries. This projection is deeply limiting for both people involved because it prevents genuine intimacy and keeps both parties locked in unconscious psychological patterns. The process of withdrawing your constant availability is actually a form of shadow integration for you as a woman. It requires you to face the parts of yourself that have been conditioned to believe that your worth comes from how much you can give to others. Many women discover that beneath their compulsive giving lies a deep terror of abandonment, a wound that often stretches back to early childhood experiences of conditional love. When you choose to stop chasing, you're forced to sit with these uncomfortable feelings without immediately seeking relief through renewed contact. This psychological discomfort is actually the beginning of profound healing. Instead of constantly projecting your need for love onto him, you begin to develop what the Stoics called amor fati, a love of your own fate that doesn't depend on external circumstances. You start to cultivate an internal locus of control that makes you genuinely attractive rather than just needy in an appealing way. This shift from external to internal validation is one of the most challenging and rewarding aspects of psychological development. The masculine psyche responds to this shift in ways that most women never anticipate. When you stop being predictable, when your emotional responses are no longer guaranteed, you activate what evolutionary psychologists call mate value uncertainty. His unconscious mind begins to question whether he's adequately appreciated your worth, whether other men might recognize what he's been taking for granted, whether he's made a terrible miscalculation in his level of investment. This uncertainty doesn't just make him think about you more. It fundamentally alters his perception of your value in the relationship marketplace. Suddenly, you're not the woman who's always available for his convenience. You're the woman who has other priorities, other sources of fulfillment, other options. Even if none of this is explicitly stated, the energetic shift is unmistakable and profoundly impactful on his unconscious processing. The art of strategic absence isn't about being cruel or manipulative. It's about honoring your own psychological needs and allowing natural attraction dynamics to operate without interference. When you constantly chase, you're actually interfering with his ability to miss you, to appreciate you, to recognize your value in his life. You're solving emotional problems for him that he needs to feel motivated to solve himself. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, often requires us to withdraw our projections from others and take responsibility for our own psychological wholeness. When you stop making his emotional state your responsibility, when you stop trying to manage his feelings about you through constant availability, you force both of you to mature psychologically. You begin to relate as two sovereign individuals rather than as two have seeking completion through merger. The feminine shadow often contains what Jung called the terrible mother archetype, the part of the feminine psyche that can be demanding, controlling, and manipulative when its needs aren't met directly. When you learn to step back and stop chasing, you're actually integrating the shadow aspect in a healthy way. Instead of becoming demanding or manipulative, you simply become unavailable for dynamics that don't serve your highest good. This integration work is profoundly attractive to psychologically mature men because it signals that you're doing your own inner work rather than expecting them to carry your emotional stability. Men who are ready for real partnership are drawn to women who have developed their own psychological sovereignty, who can be present without being clingy, who can love without losing themselves in the process. You know what's beautiful about this transformation? It doesn't matter if this particular man recognizes your worth or not. The woman who has learned to stop chasing, who has developed genuine self-love and psychological independence, naturally attracts people who are capable of appreciating her depth. She's no longer energetically available for relationships that operate on scarcity, neediness, or unconscious power dynamics. If you felt something shift inside you while reading this, if there's a part of you that recognizes these patterns in your own relationships, I want you to know that you're not alone in this journey. There are thousands of women around the world who are learning to love themselves so deeply that they naturally attract the kind of love they truly deserve. Take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel, because we're building something special here, a community of women who refuse to settle for emotional crumbs and are committed to their own psychological evolution. Share in the comments below what resonated most deeply with you, because your insights help other women on this same path of empowerment and self-discovery. The alchemy that occurs when a woman fully embodies her own worth rather than seeking it through constant pursuit is nothing short of transformational. She stops operating from what psychologists call anxious attachment, where every interaction is filtered through the lens of, will this make him like me more? Or, am I losing him? Instead, she begins to operate from what Jung would recognize as the integrated feminine, the archetype of the woman who knows her own value and doesn't negotiate it based on others' responses. This shift creates what can only be described as an energetic reversal. Where once she was the one creating all the momentum in the relationship, suddenly the dynamic inverts. Her absence creates a vacuum that he feels compelled to fill. But this isn't just about him missing her physical presence. It's about him beginning to feel the loss of the feminine energy that he had unconsciously come to depend upon without ever truly appreciating its depth or rarity. The masculine psyche is wired to value what requires effort to obtain and maintain. This isn't shallow or calculating. It's a fundamental aspect of how men are psychologically constructed. When something comes too easily, when it's always available, the unconscious mind categorizes it as low value, even if the conscious mind knows better. This creates the paradox that many women struggle to understand. The more available you make yourself, the less he values your availability. But when you step back, when you stop being the constant initiator, when you redirect that energy toward your own psychological development and creative expression, something profound happens in the space between you. He begins to experience what the Stoic philosophers called preferred indifference, those things that aren't necessary for happiness, but whose absence is definitely noticed. Your attention, your emotional availability, your feminine presence all suddenly shift from being taken for granted constants to being precious resources that require conscious effort to access. The process of learning to ignore him in this psychologically sophisticated way requires you to do deep shadow work around your own relationship to power. Many women have been conditioned to believe that feminine power lies in giving, in nurturing, in being endlessly available for others' needs. But this is actually a distortion of true feminine power, which lies in knowing when to give and when to withhold, when to be present and when to be absent, when to engage and when to preserve your energy for more worthy recipients. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that allows us to hold opposites in creative tension rather than collapsing into one extreme or the other. The woman who has mastered the art of strategic absence has integrated this transcendent function in her relationships. She can be loving without being desperate, caring without being clingy, interested without being obsessed. This psychological sophistication is rare and therefore incredibly valuable to men who have developed beyond their most primitive emotional patterns. The trauma responses that drive compulsive pursuit in relationships often stem from childhood experiences of inconsistent love. When a child learns that love must be earned through performance, through meeting others' needs, through constant vigilance about others' emotional states, she develops what psychologists call a fawn response. This trauma adaptation can persist into adult relationships, where the woman unconsciously believes that she must constantly prove her worth through endless giving and availability. Healing this trauma pattern requires learning to tolerate the anxiety that arises when you're not actively managing someone else's feelings about you. It means sitting with the discomfort of not knowing where you stand without immediately seeking reassurance. It means developing what the Stoics called ataraxia, a kind of unshakable inner peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances or other people's responses. When you develop this level of inner stability, your entire energetic signature changes. You stop broadcasting desperation or neediness, even in subtle ways that you might not have been aware of before. Men pick up on these energetic frequencies unconsciously, and a woman who has learned to be content within herself regardless of his behavior becomes magnetic in ways that conscious strategy never could achieve. The neuroscience behind this transformation is equally fascinating. When you stop being in constant reaction mode about his behavior, when you stop checking your phone obsessively, or analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings. Your nervous system downregulates from chronic stress into a more peaceful baseline. This physiological shift affects everything from your posture to your voice tone to the way you move through space. You literally become a different version of yourself. This calmer, more centered version of you is exponentially more attractive than the anxious, pursuing version ever was. Men are unconsciously drawn to women who seem at peace with themselves, who aren't constantly seeking external validation, who have developed what Jung called psychological virginity, a kind of untouched wholeness that exists independent of relationship status. The spiritual dimensions of this work cannot be ignored. When you stop chasing external validation and start developing internal wholeness, you're engaging in what mystics throughout history have called the great work. You're learning to love yourself so completely that you naturally attract others who are capable of recognizing and appreciating that self-love. You're moving from what A Course in Miracles calls special love, which is really a form of neediness, to holy love, which is an expression of abundance. The man who is taking your constant availability for granted suddenly finds himself in relationship with a woman who knows her own worth. This forces him to step up to meet you at this new level, or it reveals that he's not capable of appreciating what you have to offer. Either outcome serves your highest good, because it creates clarity about whether this relationship is truly aligned with your soul's growth. The ancient feminine mysteries understood that a woman's power lies not in what she gives, but in what she is. When you embody your own completeness, when you stop seeking completion through union with another, you become a living invitation for others to rise to meet you at your level of consciousness rather than asking you to descend to theirs. The final transformation that occurs when a woman masters the art of conscious withdrawal is perhaps the most profound. She stops needing the relationship to work out in order to feel whole. This isn't indifference or emotional numbness. It's what Jung called individuation, the process by which a person becomes psychologically complete within themselves. When you reach this level of development, you can love freely without attachment to specific outcomes, which creates the perfect conditions for authentic intimacy to flourish. The masculine unconscious responds to this level of feminine sovereignty with something approaching reverence. When a man encounters a woman who genuinely doesn't need him to complete her, who chooses to be with him from abundance rather than lack, he experiences what can only be described as spiritual recognition. This is the woman his soul has been seeking, even if his ego has been settling for less conscious dynamics. But here's what makes this so challenging for most women. Reaching this level of psychological development requires you to face every fear about being alone, every belief about your worth being dependent on having a relationship, every unconscious pattern that drives you to seek external validation. The journey from emotional dependency to sovereign wholeness is not for the faint of heart. It requires you to become comfortable with uncertainty, to develop faith in your own worth that doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition of that worth. The Stoic practice of negative visualization, where you mentally rehearse losing the things you're attached to, becomes incredibly valuable in this process. When you can genuinely imagine being happy and fulfilled without this particular man in your life, when you can feel excited about your future regardless of whether he's part of it, you've achieved something that most people never reach: true emotional freedom. This freedom is intoxicating to encounter. Men who have been in relationships with needy, clingy women suddenly find themselves in the presence of someone who doesn't need them to be different, better, or more available than they naturally are. She's not trying to change him, control him, or manage his feelings. She's simply being herself with such authenticity and groundedness that he's inspired to become the best version of himself in response. The psychological concept of secure attachment emerges naturally when two people who have done their own inner work come together. Instead of the anxious avoidant dance that characterizes most unconscious relationships, where one person pursues and the other withdraws in an endless cycle, you create what researchers call an earn secure dynamic. Both people feel safe to be vulnerable because neither is trying to get something from the other that they haven't learned to give themselves. The trauma healing that occurs through this process extends far beyond the current relationship. When you learn to stop chasing, to value yourself regardless of others' responses, to find completion within your own psychological boundaries, you're healing generational patterns of feminine disempowerment that may have been passed down through your family line for centuries. You're breaking cycles of codependency, emotional manipulation, and self-abandonment that have kept women trapped in unsatisfying relationship dynamics for generations. This healing work ripples out into every area of your life. The woman who has learned to ignore a man from a place of self-respect rather than strategy finds that her professional relationships improve, her friendships become more authentic, her creative expression flows more freely. When you're no longer leaking energy through desperate attempts to control others' feelings about you, you have so much more life force available for pursuing your own dreams and desires. The integration of what Jung called the animus, the masculine aspect of the feminine psyche, becomes essential at this stage of development. This isn't about becoming masculine in a stereotypical sense. It's about developing your own internal capacity for direction, decisiveness, and boundary setting. You become what the ancients called the woman who walks between worlds, equally comfortable in the realm of feeling and the realm of action. The man who initially took your constant availability for granted may go through several stages as he processes your withdrawal. First comes denial, where he assumes you're just having a bad day or going through a temporary phase. Then often comes anger or testing behavior, where he unconsciously tries to provoke you back into your old patterns of pursuit. This is followed by bargaining, where he might make promises or temporary changes designed to restore the previous dynamic. But if you hold your center, if you remain lovingly detached from his process while continuing to honor your own needs and boundaries, something beautiful can emerge. He begins to experience what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, where the disruption of his comfortable patterns forces him to develop new capacities for appreciation, presence, and genuine investment in the relationship. Not every man will be capable of this level of growth, and that's valuable information. The woman who has learned to embody her own worth naturally attracts people who are capable of recognizing and celebrating that worth. She repels those who are only comfortable with women who operate from insecurity and neediness. This isn't a loss. It's a gift of discernment that saves her from investing her precious life energy in people who can't appreciate her depth. The ultimate goal isn't to make him chase you. It's to become so magnificent in your own right that only people who can appreciate magnificence are drawn into your orbit. It's to develop such a rich inner life that you don't need anyone else's validation to know your own worth. It's to embody love so completely that you naturally attract others who have done the same work of becoming whole within themselves. If this message has touched something deep within your soul, if you recognize yourself in these patterns and feel ready to break free from cycles of chasing and neediness, I want you to know that transformation is absolutely possible. You have everything within you right now to become the woman who knows her worth so deeply that she never has to prove it to anyone. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to join a community of women who are committed to their own psychological evolution and spiritual growth. Leave a comment sharing your own journey towards self-love and empowerment, and let me know what topics you'd like us to explore together. Your story matters, your growth inspires others, and your commitment to becoming whole creates ripples of healing that extend far beyond what you can imagine. Together, we're redefining what it means to be a woman in relationship, and the world needs your unique contribution to this collective awakening.